A chilling beginning. It was the autumn of 1998, and the air in Chicago carried the crisp bite typical of fall mornings. A mixture of pumpkin spice, burnt leaves, and street-side cafes gearing up for the winter holidays. But beneath the charming facade of the bustling, windy city, a quiet terror was spreading, casting a long and cold shadow over its vibrant streets. The kind of terror that most law-abiding citizens never expect in the backdrop of such a lively urban heartbeat. It began subtly, with a string of unexplained disappearances overshadowed in the media by political debates, sports updates, and the latest tech launches. But for the families of the women who had gone missing, life was anything but ordinary. By September, the pattern was impossible to ignore. All the missing were women, mostly in their 20s and early 30s, with confident smiles and bright futures ahead of them. Women who enjoyed late-night cocktails with friends, gym workouts around dusk, or the occasional natural highs of online dating, were vanishing without a trace, like sand slipping between fingers. There were no ransom notes, no ID-ed suspects, and most chillingly, no bodies. The city whispered rumors of serial abductions, local forums swarmed with theories ranging from an underground trafficking ring to unimaginable urban legends. But one fact remained steadfast and sinister. The women were simply gone. At first, law enforcement dismissed these disappearances as isolated incidents, runaways perhaps, or bad relationship choices gone wrong. After all, most of these young women lived independent lives in big cities, a factor often tied to poor judgment in the eyes of detectives who worked around the clock to sift through endless files. However, what was clearly missing from each case was any sign of struggle, or any paper trail at all. No recurring activity on credit cards, no calls made from cell phones, no connections to each other, aside from their gender and demographic. To the grieving families, what made these disappearances even more unbearable was the slow grind of bureaucracy and investigation. The police were under-resourced and overburdened, barely scratching the surface while quietly hoping for some lead that could blow the case open. This sweeping silence eventually created desperation within the community, spreading the kind of fear that seeped into every street corner. To lock your doors and windows at night suddenly became more urgent than paying rent, and peering over your shoulder in a crowded train station was second nature. One woman, a mother whose daughter never came home from work, expressed it best during a brief news clip. "They call Chicago the city that works, but is it really working when women are just disappearing like ghosts? My baby isn't a ghost. She's flesh and blood. She's out there somewhere." Her plea went viral, but even then people believed fervently that predators only targeted the careless or unlucky. It wasn't until Halloween of that very year, notoriously a holiday drenched in make-believe horrors, that the real nightmare began to unravel. It wasn't make-believe, it wasn't careless or unlucky, it was calculated, methodical, and absolutely terrifying. For every stranger that smiled at you too wide on the train, for every drink left unattended at a bar, for every lingering set of eyes in a yoga studio, women of Chicago were beginning to experience daily life in a new soundtrack, paranoia. The streets of Chicago remained layered with golden leaves, but hiding underneath was a darker truth. The truth of a predator who moved among the crowds unseen, standing behind unwitting strangers on crosswalks, holding the door open at diners, or prowling dating apps with compelling charm disguised as chivalry. The vanishing women. The first missing person didn't cause much of a ripple. After all, big cities like Chicago always have people disappearing. Runaways, hidden crimes, messy breakups leading someone to uproot their life and flee. But by mid-October 1998 it was clear these weren't isolated instances. Something darker was happening, creeping under the surface of what seemed like ordinary life. By the time the third woman disappeared, the Chicago Police Department began assembling a task force to investigate the disturbing pattern. Eleanor Sims, 26, went out with friends for drinks after work on a Friday night in late September. A vibrant, outgoing young woman with a contagious laugh, Eleanor was last seen leaving a downtown bar around 1 a.m., smiling and chatting with a tall man in a dark trench coat. Security camera footage captured them walking away, but where she went after stepping into that shadowed alley remained a mystery. She never came home. Her phone went silent. Her apartment remained untouched, the keys still sitting on an entryway table. Her friends, shaken, described her as independent and careful, not the type to vanish willingly. A couple of weeks before Eleanor's disappearance, another strange case had puzzled the local authorities. Jessica Harper, a 30-year-old fitness trainer, was known for her strict schedule and morning runs along Lakeshore Drive. She was disciplined, sharp, and always on time until one Tuesday morning when Jessica didn't show up for her 6 a.m. spin class. A concerned co-worker stopped by her apartment, only to find the door locked from the inside, her belongings in place, and her wallet sitting untouched on the countertop. It was as if she had simply evaporated. As more women began to go missing, the similarities between the cases became impossible to overlook. All the victims were in their 20s or early 30s, attractive, professional, and independent. These were women who frequented bars after work, enrolled in yoga classes, and used online dating apps. They were confident, modern women who had every reason to believe they were safe navigating the city's bright lights. Each disappearance seemed random at first. No shared connections, no common neighborhoods, no overlapping social circles. But their similarities were particularly haunting. What stood out most chillingly about these cases was what wasn't there. There was no sign of struggles, no surveillance footage showing them resisting, no phone calls to loved ones hinting at trouble. Credit cards and bank accounts went silent the moment they vanished. There were no canceled appointments, no letters left behind, no goodbyes. Whatever happened to these women, it was fast, controlled, and seamless. Speculations began to swirl as media outlets picked up on the pattern. Local news ran stories hinting at everything from abductions to organized human trafficking rings. One columnist even suggested the idea of a modern-day Jack the Ripper stalking the streets of Chicago. As fear gripped the community, internet forums became a breeding ground for urban legends. Some claimed the women were secretly being sold to underground sex slavery markets. Others whispered about a deranged cult abducting young women as sacrifices. A particularly imaginative theory involved a time-traveling killer who could vanish as quickly as his victims. Despite the dire warnings, for those not directly affected, the disappearances felt distant. City life, demanding and chaotic as ever, continued. People rationalized, "It just won't happen to me," a sentiment often coupled with the belief that crime targets only those who fail to take precautions. As the cases piled up, investigative leaders found themselves overwhelmed. Detective Gerald Russo, a 22-year department veteran, described the challenging emotions surrounding the investigation. "We had nothing to go on. No witnesses, no leads. Looking at those family members, fathers, mothers, siblings, begging you for answers, it's like facing a tidal wave you can't stop." His frustration echoed that of the families, who battled both lingering hope that their loved ones might return, and the crushing fear that they wouldn't. And then there were the rumors in the streets. Some said the predator must have been someone familiar, someone the victims inherently trusted. Others speculated a professional criminal of unprecedented skill, someone who could navigate a city bustling with people yet remain utterly invisible. Communities formed neighborhood watches, curfews tightened, and women began traveling in pairs, avoiding staying out too late or answering messages from unknown admirers online. Among distressed survivors, whispers began pointing toward an eerie consistency. Eleanor's friends recalled her texting that she was meeting someone new. Jessica's neighbor had mentioned seeing her talking to a well-dressed man by her car weeks prior. Yet when their families provided these details, they seemed frustratingly vague, like pieces of a puzzle where no two fit perfectly together. By late October, fear coursed through the city like electricity on overburdened wires. Parents called their daughters nightly. Boyfriends felt helpless, driving around neighborhoods aimlessly to check just in case. Even on crowded streets, people avoided strangers, noting their features just a bit too carefully. Nervous glances were exchanged in elevators. Any unusual gesture, an outstretched hand offering to pick up a dropped wallet or an overly long smile, was regarded as inherently suspect. The scariest part about these disappearances wasn't the loss itself, it was that the city seemed powerless to stop it. People were vanishing as if they had never existed, swallowed whole by the streets themselves. In a place as populous as Chicago, where lives and stories intertwined in countless ways, how could someone disappear so completely, so mathematically precise, without leaving even the smallest breadcrumb behind? The face of the killer. Richard Grayson wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to be the subject of late-night news specials or whispered urban legends. If anything, he seemed to embody the American dream. He was the quintessential charming neighbor, the polite coworker, the well-dressed gentleman holding the elevator door open for you. At 35 years old, Richard was known around his suburban neighborhood as a successful businessman, a man who drove a clean black sedan and waved to the mailman every morning. With his sharp suits, neatly combed dark hair, and ever-present warm smile, he blended seamlessly into his community, appearing to be just another unremarkable cog in the bustling machine of Chicago life. But behind his well-manicured lawn and spotless persona lay a man whose darkness ran bone deep. Richard Grayson wasn't simply a monster concealed under human skin, he was the kind of predator society admired, trusted, and instinctively let its guard down around. Born in the small Midwestern town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Richard grew up in a lower-middle-class family that struggled to stay afloat. His mother, an emotionally unstable woman prone to violent outbursts, was the dominant force in young Richard's life. She belittled him for everything, from the way he walked to the way he smiled, and, under her cruelty, Richard developed an inferiority complex that would shape his adult years. His father, a passive man uninterested in confrontation, often vanished into the background of their chaotic household. Hoping to escape his oppressive home life, Richard buried himself in schoolwork and cultivated an image of perfection, a strategy he carried with him long after leaving Cedar Rapids. But while Richard's exterior screamed success, his private world was a wasteland. Relationships seemed to elude him, not because he was unattractive, far from it. His strong jawline, piercing blue eyes, and meticulously groomed appearance earned him plenty of attention. Yet he failed to connect with women emotionally. He radiated charm but lacked depth. Many women described interactions with him as too perfect, too polished, as if there was something manufactured about the way he carried himself. They couldn't put their finger on what it was, but it made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. By his late 20s, things began to spiral. Richard moved to Chicago, drawn by the promise of anonymity in a sprawling city. He reinvented himself, working as a mid-level real estate agent capturing the booming housing market of the late 1990s. Despite achieving a sense of financial stability, he remained bitter and empty inside. Failed romantic pursuits deepened his resentment toward women, particularly those he saw as unintentionally toying with his emotions. The confident, independent ones who could easily dismiss him with a polite smile and a softly spoken, "I'm just not interested." For Richard, these rejections weren't minor inconveniences, they were personal affronts, proof of his inadequacy, a validation of all the hateful whispers his mother had hissed into his ears as a boy. Little by little he began to stew in his resentment. Women, he believed, were nothing more than creatures of vanity and deceit. In his warped mind, it wasn't just the women who rejected him personally that were guilty, it was all women. This pervasive bitterness festered like an untreated infection, turning what had been general discontentment into a dangerous obsession. What terrified Richard wasn't the idea that he lacked control over them, it was realizing how much power they seemed to have over him. And so, he decided to turn the tables. He would become the one pulling the strings, the one with all the power. Richard's descent into violence began innocently enough, if one could ever use that word. Small things, petty thefts, scraps of arguments with neighbors who parked too close to his driveway, spilling a drink on a co-worker accidentally on purpose during a company mixer. He relished in these tiny moments of control, but they barely scratched the itch that clawed deep within him. Richard wanted something more substantial, an act that made him feel completely untouchable. His first murder, carried out on an icy January evening in 1997, would mark the point of no return. The victim, a waitress from a downtown diner, was someone Richard had observed for weeks. She fit the profile perfectly, energetic, young, unwilling to participate in his flirtations no matter how charismatic he thought himself to be. To the outsider, the killing seemed like a terrible accident. She had been found in a frozen alleyway, her handbag stolen, her neck bruised. But to Richard, it was nothing short of liberation. For the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of power trip through his veins. She had stopped being a person in his eyes, she was simply a means to prove one terrifying truth to himself. Richard Grayson mattered. What shocked even those who saw the wreckage of Richard's crimes years later was how methodical he remained throughout his killing spree. There was no recklessness, no impulsiveness. If anything, the murders were executed like business deals, precisely calculated, neatly finished, and utterly devoid of emotional attachment. He tailored his weapon of charm to lure his victims, a small knowing smile, a flawless ability to mirror their interests and aspirations, all wrapped in the guise of genuine kindness. He swapped identities like a river changing currents. To some, he was an out-of-town architect casually passing through, to others, an aspiring entrepreneur looking for local insight. He haunted dating apps and singles bars, where the anonymity of big city life worked like a mask. For many women, Richard was the perfect package. It wasn't until later, too late, that he became their final, horrifying discovery. Perhaps the most haunting thing about Richard Grayson wasn't the violence of his actions. It was his disarming normalcy. He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleyways or a madman rambling on street corners. No, Richard Grayson could be anyone. He was the man holding your grocery bags up the stairs, the guy giving you directions when you looked lost, the stranger flashing a warm smile from across a crowded room. By the time you realized the malice hidden beneath his polished exterior, it was too late. Too late to realize that this charming, ordinary man was the gentleman killer, method of murder. Richard Grayson's method of killing was as meticulous as it was terrifying. Like everything else about him, it was calculated, controlled, and wrapped in an unsettling veneer of charm. His success as a serial killer didn't come from brute force or blind luck, but from his ability to portray himself as someone trustworthy, safe, and even desirable. The last person anyone would suspect of having a darker agenda. His approach always began with precision targeting. Richard didn't just kill anyone. He had a specific type. Women in their late 20s to early 30s, independent, attractive, and often outgoing. He sought women who reminded him of the ones who had rejected him, the ones he believed had hurt or humiliated him in the past. These women, in his twisted mind, became symbols of everything he hated, and each new victim was his way of reclaiming control over what he felt he had lost. Richard operated like a spider weaving its web, skillfully drawing his prey closer without them ever realizing the danger. He used his charm like a weapon, and his good looks were his ticket into their trust. He would often meet his victims through dating platforms where his profile was curated to exude charisma and stability. His job as a real estate agent served as a perfect alibi. It allowed him access to high-end locations and naturally created opportunities for casual, non-threatening conversations. To his victims, Richard seemed like a polished, successful professional who just happened to be exceptionally kind and attentive. Once Richard had identified a target, the process followed a disturbingly consistent pattern. He would arrange to meet them in a public, lively setting, a bar, a coffee shop, or a trendy Chicago restaurant. His strategy was simple but effective. Let his smile and confidence do the talking. Women often described him as someone who could light up a room, his perfectly rehearsed jokes and compliments enough to make anyone's defenses crumble. He had mastered the art of mirroring, subtly mimicking his target's body language and interests to make them feel an instant connection. This, coupled with his ability to listen attentively and appear genuinely invested, set the stage for what came next. When his victims let their guard down, Richard would offer to escort them home, or invite them into his car under the pretense of giving them a safe ride. If they agreed, his act became even more sinister. He would calmly engage them in light-hearted conversation, sometimes playing their favorite music, or sharing anecdotes from his so-called humble beginnings. There was no rush, no sense of unease. Richard wanted them to feel as comfortable as possible before he made his move. Once they were in his domain, often his suburban home or a property he had access to through work, his mask of friendliness slipped away. Richard's home was more than just a sanctuary. It was the stage for his crimes, crafted with chilling precision. Thanks to his attention to detail, the house was practically a fortress. It had soundproof walls, secure locks, and a basement outfitted with tools and a lidded industrial furnace. This space was his secret, hidden from the eyes of neighbors and authorities alike. Richard's preferred method of murder was as cold and calculated as his personality. He used chemical manipulation to immobilize his victims. Often he would offer them a drink, a cocktail or glass of wine laced with a fast-acting sedative. The effects of the drug would take hold quickly, leaving his victims disoriented and sluggish. He remained eerily calm during these moments, methodically preparing for what came next as though he were about to conduct a business meeting. Once his victims were incapacitated, Richard would strike with precision. He favored strangulation, a practice that required close contact and complete control. Unlike a gunshot or stabbing which could leave evidence or draw attention, strangulation was quiet, methodical, and, most importantly to Richard, intimate. It allowed him to look his victims in the eye as the life drained out of them, something he later admitted gave him a twisted sense of power and fulfillment. For Richard, the act of taking control over another person's life was the ultimate high. If the victim fought back, Richard wasn't fazed. His strength and composure during these moments only amplified the chilling nature of his crimes. He didn't see these women as human beings but as objects, obstacles to obliterate in his pursuit of dominance. Once the victim was dead, his calculated efficiency took over again. The disposal of the body was as systematic as the murder itself. Richard's basement furnace served a grisly purpose. He would place the bodies into the industrial fire, ensuring that any trace of evidence, hair, fingerprints, or skin cells, was reduced to ash. He had a method for everything, even down to the chemicals he used to accelerate the decomposition process and obscure potential forensic trails. For larger remains, Richard would grind the bones into a fine powder, scattering them in remote locations, rivers, or construction sites. These actions weren't just about evading law enforcement. They were another way for him to assert dominance, to ensure that his victims would completely vanish, with nothing left to link him to their deaths. Despite his cold efficiency, Richard had another, more unsettling aspect to his method: trophies. Like many serial killers, he would keep small items from his victims, personal mementos that only he would understand. Rings, necklaces, high heels, diaries, these were his twisted souvenirs, hidden in a locked cabinet in his bedroom. Each item was like a grisly trophy, a reminder of his ability to kill without consequence. To those around him, these items would appear harmless, but to Richard, they were symbols of his victories, a private collection of evidence that whispered his dark secret back to him every time he opened the drawer. Perhaps the most disturbing piece of Richard's method was his ability to mask any trace of remorse or hesitation. After completing his crimes, he could stroll into a meeting or neighborhood gathering the next morning without a hint of guilt. He would water his plants, laugh at his coworkers' jokes, and volunteer at community cleanups while families across Chicago mourned, clinging to faint hopes their daughters might still return. Richard's method wasn't just about killing, it was about control, precision, and the terrifying ability to operate undetected. His charm disarmed his targets, his methodical planning ensured his success, and his cold logic allowed him to continue unhindered for years. What made him most dangerous was that he didn't need to hide under the cover of darkness or skulk in alleyways. He could kill in plain sight and then blend back into the crowd, like smoke disappearing into the night. Behind every handshake, every polite smile, and every kind gesture was a predator waiting to strike. And by the time his victims realized the truth, it was already too late. The strategy of concealment. Richard Grayson's strategy for hiding his crimes was as intricate and twisted as the murders themselves. He wasn't simply trying to avoid getting caught, he turned concealment into an art form, a way to perfect the control he craved. Every move he made was calibrated with one singular goal: to erase his victims as though they had never existed. First and foremost, his suburban home wasn't just a residence. It was his fortress, specifically designed to cover up his horrifying secrets. Located in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood just outside Chicago, the house exuded normalcy. A white picket fence framed a manicured lawn, and well-tended flower beds lined the walkway. Neighbors described it as quaint and charming. But what they couldn't see, what no one could see, was the hidden darkness meticulously tucked behind those pastel yellow walls. Richard's basement was the epicenter of his crimes, a nightmarish space hidden beneath the ordinary suburban exterior. At first glance, the basement looked like any other: a few shelves holding neatly stacked boxes, a washer and dryer humming quietly in one corner. But behind a locked steel door lay a soundproofed killing room that Richard had carefully constructed. The room was stark, sterile, and bone-chilling. Padded walls muffled every sound, ensuring that no scream would ever escape. Industrial lighting illuminated the space with a ghastly clinical glow, and heavy-duty locks were installed to guarantee no one could enter or leave without Richard's permission. Every detail served a purpose. The furniture consisted of nothing but stainless steel tables and chairs that could be wiped clean within seconds. The floor was lined with epoxy resin to prevent any stains from seeping into the foundation. Richard had even installed a state-of-the-art ventilation system, ensuring that no odor, be it chemical or biological, would alert his neighbors. But the most unsettling feature of the basement was the industrial furnace. Initially purchased under the pretense of metalworking hobbies, it was a tool Richard used with brutal efficiency. The furnace, capable of reaching temperatures high enough to incinerate bone, was his primary means of disposing of his victims' remains. With it, Richard reduced bodies to ash, leaving no physical evidence behind for law enforcement to trace. He believed fiercely in his own system: clean, thorough, untraceable. Richard had another layer of strategy, one that relied on his obsession with perfection. After each killing, he meticulously cleaned the murder site until it looked untouched. He used specialized industrial-grade cleaning agents sourced from obscure suppliers, ensuring that no forensic evidence, not even a stray hair or drop of blood, could be found. The tools he used, from the restraints to the instruments of murder, were either destroyed or sanitized beyond recognition. Richard's routine after every killing was more rigorous than most people's spring cleaning, and the disturbing part was how much he enjoyed it. For him, the act of erasing his crimes wasn't just about self-preservation, it was a means of asserting his dominance, proving that he could outsmart anyone who dared to investigate him. Richard's ability to conceal his crimes extended far beyond his home. He was deliberate in the way he chose his victims and the locations where he approached them. Large urban areas like Chicago made it easy for him to blend in. He often targeted women who lived alone or who had fewer close family ties, thereby reducing the chances of someone noticing their absence quickly. Even the places he frequented, bars, gyms, and dating apps, were chosen with care. He avoided returning to the same places too often, ensuring no one would recognize him or identify a pattern in his behavior. Richard also excelled at manipulating technology to aid his concealment. His phone and computer were wiped clean of any evidence that could link him to his victims. Fake profiles on dating apps allowed him to lure targets without connecting back to his real identity. He used burner phones for communication, which he would discard immediately after arranging a meeting. His digital footprint was so meticulously crafted that even seasoned cyber investigators would have struggled to piece it together. However, Richard didn't rely solely on physical and digital strategies. He also manipulated the people around him to strengthen his alibi. His polished demeanor and neighborly charm made it almost impossible for anyone to suspect him of wrongdoing. He volunteered at local community events, attended church occasionally, and was on a first-name basis with many of his neighbors. To the outside world, Richard Grayson was nothing more than a well-dressed, polite, and successful businessman. His calm, unassuming presence allowed him to deflect suspicion with ease. Even when rumors about a potential serial killer began spreading, Richard actively participated in conversations about the disappearances, feigning concern and debate just like everyone else. Still, perhaps the darkest part of his strategy wasn't the physical act of hiding his crimes, it was the trophies. Richard's souvenirs of his murders were grotesquely intimate, stored in a locked cabinet in his bedroom. They were small, seemingly insignificant items, a single earring, a bracelet, a cracked phone case, or a pair of high heels. To the casual observer, these items might have looked like random clutter, but to Richard, each one was a macabre symbol of control and power. Each item represented a life he had taken, a moment when he had proven, at least to himself, that he was untouchable. What made Richard's strategy so horrifyingly effective was how normal he appeared. He didn't fit any of the stereotypes associated with serial killers. He wasn't reclusive or socially awkward, he wasn't overly secretive. He lived a life that seemed wide open to public scrutiny, all while hiding his most sinister secrets in plain sight. He relied on society's inability to reconcile kindness with malevolence, betting on the fact that nobody would believe a man who smiled so warmly and waved to his neighbors every morning could also be a monster. In the end, Richard's strategy of concealment was almost perfect. Almost. For years, he operated with impunity, his methods leaving law enforcement baffled. But no system, no matter how meticulous, is truly unbreakable. It would only take one mistake, one stray hair, one overlooked detail, or one woman courageous enough to escape the nightmare, for the truth to begin unraveling. The brave woman who exposed the truth. It was a cold Halloween night in 2001 when Cynthia Harper found herself fighting not just for her life but for her very sense of humanity. By the time she realized the charming man who had shared drinks with her earlier that evening wasn't who he appeared to be, she was already trapped inside his house of horrors. Bound, disoriented, and terrified in the soundproofed basement of Richard Grayson's suburban home, Cynthia had no choice but to rely on her instincts, a final, desperate gamble to survive what would have been her last few hours alive. Cynthia, a 29-year-old graphic designer working in downtown Chicago, had always considered herself cautious and independent. That Halloween she had hesitated to go out but was persuaded by friends to join an after-work gathering at a buzzing city bar. It was there she first encountered Richard, who introduced himself as a philanthropist in real estate. His suit was sharp, his demeanor charming, and his laugh, warm but not overbearing, made her feel at ease. He wasn't pushy or aggressive, two qualities she knew to avoid in strangers. Instead, he seemed attentive, polite, and refreshingly normal. It wasn't long before her defenses were down, and when he offered her a ride home she hesitated only momentarily before accepting. After all, he was so polite, and he promised to drop her off at her doorstep. But instead of taking her directly home, Richard suggested they make a quick stop at his place. He smiled, assuring her it wouldn't take more than a minute. By the time Cynthia realized something was terribly wrong, it was far too late. The doors of his home locked with a mechanism she couldn't understand. The air felt colder, heavier, as he guided her toward the basement with the promise of showing her something cool. Her heart sank when she saw the steel-reinforced room at the bottom of the stairs. That was when he dropped the mask entirely. What followed was the most harrowing 3 hours of Cynthia's life. Richard stripped away every ounce of his gentlemanly demeanor, replacing it with an unsettling calm as he tied her to the steel chair bolted to the floor. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lose composure. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this too many times before. To Cynthia, nothing about him in those moments suggested anger or passion, only cold indifference. She was no longer a woman to him but an object, a pawn in whatever twisted game he was playing. But Cynthia was different. Unlike his previous victims, she wasn't ready to give up quietly. Gritting her teeth through the mind-numbing terror, she began to observe him, to think, to bide her time. She noticed the faint smell of the cleaning agents he used. She watched how he moved with clinical precision as he prepped for what he clearly thought would be his next perfect crime. And most importantly, she noticed when he left the room briefly, leaving her unattended, just for a few seconds but long enough for her to act. Feigning unconsciousness, Cynthia let her body go limp, using every ounce of courage she had to play dead. She knew it was a risk. Richard might see through her ruse, but it was all she had. When Richard leaned down to check her pulse, his movements were steady, confident. That was when she struck. Using the edge of a broken zip tie she had been slowly clawing apart on the chair's armrest, she lashed out, targeting his face. The attack wasn't enough to seriously harm him, but it startled him just long enough for Cynthia to make her move. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, she bolted toward the stairs. The heavy locks on the door slowed her for a moment, but she managed to force it open, her shaking hands propelled by pure will. Behind her, she could hear Richard's furious footsteps, his calm demeanor finally shattered as he bellowed for her to stop. She didn't look back. The cool night air hit her face like a slap when she stumbled into the street, screaming for help. Cynthia ran blindly, her voice hoarse as she shouted for anyone to hear her. She was half-dressed, her wrists raw from the restraints, but she didn't stop running until she saw headlights. A passing car slowed, the driver's face a mix of concern and confusion as they heard her story. Without hesitation they called 911, and Cynthia finally collapsed in tears. She had escaped. At the station she recounted every horrifying detail to the Chicago police. The officers were skeptical at first. Richard Grayson, the well-dressed businessman with no criminal record and glowing references in the community? It seemed impossible, but Cynthia was relentless. She described everything: the steel room, the bindings, the sounds, the furnace disguised as a simple home appliance. She gave them specifics, down to the smell of chemicals clinging to his clothes, and most importantly, she carried proof. A small bloody patch of skin she had ripped from Richard's face during her struggle. It would later reveal his DNA under her nails, providing the link investigators needed. For days, authorities hesitated, unwilling to fully commit to Cynthia's story. Richard was connected, respected, and wealthy, everything Cynthia wasn't. But the FBI eventually stepped in, pressured by the growing public outcry and Cynthia's unwavering persistence. When they raided Richard's suburban home days later, everything she had described was there. The soundproofed basement, the industrial furnace, and an ominous locked cabinet containing trophies from the women he had killed. Cynthia's bravery didn't just save her own life, it unraveled the secret life of one of Chicago's most prolific serial killers. For years, Richard Grayson had operated with impunity, hiding behind his charm and calculated strategies. Cynthia shattered that illusion in one night, exposing him for who he truly was, a cold-blooded predator whose reign of terror had finally come to an end: the police's indifference. In the early days of the Richard Grayson investigation, the police's response to the growing number of missing women was a glaring example of systemic indifference. Chicago, like most bustling metropolitan cities, is a place where hundreds of people go missing annually. Runaways, drug-related disappearances, or even situations involving personal choices, these cases, law enforcement believed, typically sorted themselves out. Why waste precious resources investigating someone who might simply reappear on their own, However, with the disappearances mounting, each one eerily similar in behavior, demographic, and profile, a pattern should have been recognized. Eleanor Sims, Jessica Harper, and countless others had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind no suspects, no bodies, and no answers. If ever there was a reason to treat these cases with urgency, this was it. Yet for months the police brushed aside concerns from frantic families, labeling these women as either runaways or victims of bad decisions. According to the police, these incidents weren't connected, and therefore didn't warrant escalated attention. This inaction stemmed from an underlying bias that was both societal and institutional. Many officials believed young, modern women living independently in a city were prone to risky behavior, and worse, that they bore responsibility for the consequences. "She probably fell in with the wrong crowd," was a sentiment cynically echoed by one detective when pressed about the investigations. Others implied that these women, having been active on dating platforms or socializing late at bars, had invited danger into their lives. To some officers, this wasn't a case of women being hunted by an organized killer. Instead, it was a narrative tailor-made to reinforce outdated views about personal responsibility and caution. One of the most damning cases of police negligence came from the story of Jessica Harper's disappearance. Jessica, the fitness trainer who vanished one quiet Tuesday morning, had a co-worker who immediately reported her missing after she failed to show up for her spin class. Normally punctual and impossibly dedicated, Jessica's absence raised more than just eyebrows among her friends. Yet, when her co-worker approached the police, they were dismissed outright. Detectives suggested that Jessica might have taken a spontaneous trip, despite the fact that her car was still parked outside her apartment, and her wallet and phone were found inside. "Adults can come and go as they please," the officer had said with a shrug. Such indifference echoed with every missing person report that came through the precincts. Families expressed growing frustration as their pleas for help were met with procedural roadblocks and bureaucratic red tape. In most of the cases, officers insisted on waiting a mandatory 48 hours before officially launching a missing persons inquiry, even in situations where the disappearances appeared highly unusual. This delay, a seemingly minor technicality in the grander picture of law enforcement, would prove fatally consequential. In Richard Grayson's world, 48 hours was all it took to erase a person completely. The mother of Eleanor Sims summed it up best during a gut-wrenching television interview. "If my daughter were a CEO or someone famous, they'd be kicking down doors trying to find her. But because she's just a regular girl, they assume she isn't worth the effort. My daughter is not disposable. My daughter is worth fighting for." The indifference wasn't limited to families either. It spread through Chicago's underground whispers like wildfire. Neighborhoods began to organize their own search efforts when it became clear the police had no intention of doing so. Flyers were plastered on lampposts, vending machines, and bus stops with the faces of women who'd vanished. Community meetings grew tense as activists accused law enforcement of ignoring the victims simply because they didn't fit a priority profile. For women living alone in the city, the lack of action became a wake-up call. They installed extra locks, enrolled in self-defense classes, and carried pepper spray as a default. Chicago shouldn't have felt like a war zone for its female residents, but it did. What little trust the public had in the police to protect them began to unravel. One of the most critical turning points came in the form of Cynthia Harper's daring escape. When she arrived at the police station bruised, shaken, and terrified, her story should have galvanized immediate action. Cynthia was no missing person, the evidence was clear, the threat was real, and the killer was still out there. But even then, the police hesitated. A decorated businessman like Richard Grayson couldn't possibly be responsible for such heinous crimes. The officer who took her initial statement reportedly asked Cynthia, "Are you sure you weren't misreading the situation?" The implication was clear. How could such a charming, successful man be capable of what Cynthia was describing? It wasn't until Cynthia presented undeniable proof, the bloodied scrap of skin she had ripped from Richard's face, and the detailed description of his soundproofed basement, that the police were forced to take her seriously. Even then, it wasn't local authorities who sprung into decisive action. It was the FBI, who were dragged into the case after Cynthia's story gained national media attention. Only under mounting public pressure did Chicago PD belatedly begin their own comprehensive investigation, but by then, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. The police's initial failure to act had been catastrophic. Had they connected the dots sooner, had they treated these missing persons cases with greater urgency, Richard Grayson's reign of terror might have ended long before it did. Lives could have been saved. Families could have been spared the anguish of waiting endlessly for answers that were never going to come. Instead, bureaucratic apathy and harmful assumptions created the perfect storm in which a predator like Richard could thrive, unchecked. In hindsight, the Richard Grayson case became a damning example of everything that could go wrong when systemic indifference and societal biases collide. For too long, the victims had been reduced to statistics, the kind of cases that could be swept under the rug without anyone noticing, but in this case, the voices of those left behind, mothers, sisters, friends, refused to be silenced. Their relentless determination, alongside Cynthia's extraordinary bravery, forced law enforcement to reckon with a painful truth. They had failed. And for Chicago, that realization left scars that would never fully heal. The investigation and exposing the truth. For years, Richard Grayson operated in the shadows, leaving behind no clues, no trails, and no survivors, until the night Cynthia Harper broke free from his grasp. Her testimony, and the undeniable evidence she carried with her, cracked the case wide open. What followed was a high-stakes investigation, one that would uncover layers of depravity that left even seasoned law enforcement officers speechless. When Cynthia reported her harrowing escape, the Chicago police initially hesitated. After all, Richard Grayson was no ordinary suspect. He was a clean-cut, sharply dressed businessman with a respected reputation in his affluent suburban community. But Cynthia's description of the soundproofed basement, the steel restraints, and the industrial furnace, coupled with the DNA evidence scraped from under her fingernails, left no room for dismissal. Reluctantly, detectives began to dig into the man who seemed incapable of hiding such monstrous secrets. The investigation was slow to gain traction. Chicago PD, lacking experience in handling serial crimes of this magnitude, reached out to the FBI for assistance. A task force was quickly assembled, bringing together forensic experts, behavioral analysts, and technology specialists to piece together the mysterious puzzle of Richard Grayson's life. The first order of business was a search warrant for his suburban home, a deceptively charming property that mirrored the picturesque image of American success. The reality lurking inside, however, was far from that dream. On a frigid November morning, a swarm of law enforcement officers surrounded Grayson's home. The warrant execution was conducted with strategic precision, as investigators were aware of Grayson's intelligence and meticulousness. From the outside, neighbors peeked through curtains, shocked to see the police presence at the home of their seemingly upstanding neighbor. Inside, the scene was far more chilling. The first indication that something was deeply wrong came when officers discovered the locked door to Grayson's basement. The steel-reinforced frame and digital locks raised immediate red flags. After bypassing the security system, they stepped into a space that haunted even the most experienced members of the team. The basement was cold and clinical, its walls padded to muffle noise and its floors lined with epoxy to prevent any trace of blood from seeping into the foundation. The eerie glow of industrial lighting illuminated the room, revealing stainless steel tables, surgical-grade instruments, and bottles of chemical cleaners meticulously stored on shelves. This wasn't the basement of a real estate agent. It was the lair of a predator who had honed his craft with terrifying efficiency. The centerpiece of the discovery was the industrial furnace Cynthia had described. Investigators found traces of human remains, microscopic evidence of ash and bone embedded in the furnace's exhaust system. This alone was damning, but it wasn't the only evidence. Adjacent to the furnace was a cabinet, locked tightly but soon pried open by forensic experts. Its contents confirmed everyone's worst fears. Inside, laid out with almost grotesque care, were the trophies Richard had kept from each of his victims. Jewelry, diaries, photographs, even small personal trinkets. These weren't just random objects, they were deeply personal items, mementos of lives tragically cut short. Each trophy told a story, and together they painted a horrific picture of a man who thrived not just on killing, but on control, power, and the grotesque satisfaction of remembering his crimes. While the physical evidence was critical, the real breakthrough came in the form of Richard's financial records and digital footprint. The FBI's cyber unit uncovered a trove of damning information that revealed the calculating precision of his actions. Grayson had routinely purchased chemicals and tools under fake names, often using cash or untraceable methods of payment. Orders for sedatives, restraints, and industrial-grade cleaning supplies were traced back to him despite his efforts to mask their origin. Furthermore, Grayson's meticulously curated online presence came under intense scrutiny. Fake profiles on dating apps revealed how he had preyed on his victims, carefully selecting women who fit his profile and luring them into his trap with manufactured charm. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the investigation was the scope of his crimes. Interviews with neighbors and acquaintances painted an image of a man who blended effortlessly into society, an asset to his community, a friendly neighbor, and a respected professional. It was unfathomable that someone so normal could be responsible for such horrors. And yet, as investigators built their timeline, they uncovered a staggering pattern of disappearances dating back to early 1997. There was no doubt, Richard Grayson was not only a predator, but one of the most prolific serial killers in Chicago's history. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded to corroborate the stories of grieving families. For years, these families had been dismissed by law enforcement, told that their daughters, sisters, and friends were probably fine, or had chosen to leave of their own accord. Now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, the task force reached out to these families with sobering updates. The remains found in Richard's furnace were too few to provide full identifications, but DNA testing on his trophies linked him directly to at least 12 missing women. Their names, once just faces on missing posters scattered across the city, were now etched into the case files as victims of Grayson's calculated cruelty. The media caught wind of the revelations, and news vans swarmed the suburban street where Richard's home stood as if it were any other cookie-cutter residence. The world watched in shock as the layers of his double life unraveled in real time. Headlines described the basement as a house of horrors, and Richard Grayson became a national symbol of evil hiding in plain sight. His photograph flooded television screens, a man with a confident smile, a neatly tailored suit, and predatory eyes that belied his amiable facade. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to analyze every piece of evidence, ensuring that nothing was left unchecked. Behavioral analysts constructed a psychological profile of Grayson, which would later be presented in court. They described him as cold, calculating, and narcissistic, driven by an obsessive need for control. His murders weren't impulsive but deliberate, each one a methodical exercise in asserting dominance over his victims. By the time the investigation concluded, the case against Grayson was airtight. Thanks to Cynthia Harper's bravery and the tireless work of the task force, they had uncovered enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of first-degree murder. Finally, families who had waited years for answers began to see a glimmer of justice on the horizon. This investigation became one of the most significant in Chicago's history, a testament to the persistence of those who refused to let their voices be silenced. It revealed not only the horrors of a single man's crimes, but also the failings of a system that had allowed him to thrive for far too long. The truth had been exposed, and justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. The trial that shook the nation. The trial of Richard Grayson was unlike any case Chicago or the United States had ever seen. For 6 months the nation's eyes were glued to the courtroom where a man who had once been viewed as the epitome of success and charm faced justice for a series of unimaginable crimes. What began as whispers of a serial predator spiraled into an explosive and shocking trial that would leave no one untouched. The courtroom itself became a stage, both for the prosecution's brutal truths and the defense's desperate attempts to salvage Grayson's humanity. It was a battle not just of legal minds but of emotions, manipulation, and deep moral reckonings about how someone so dangerous could have remained hidden in plain sight for so long. Families of the victims, members of Richard's former social circles, seasoned reporters, and curious citizens filled every seat in the gallery, hanging on every word, every piece of evidence, every revelation. Lines for entry into the courthouse stretched around the block, as what unfolded inside was a chilling confrontation between unfathomable evil and the justice system. Opening arguments: innocence versus brutality. Richard Grayson entered the Chicago courtroom on a crisp March morning in 2002. Dressed sharply in a dark navy suit, his hair immaculately combed, he looked anything but a killer. If one were to judge his demeanor alone, they might mistake him for a corporate executive fending off a frivolous lawsuit, not a man accused of strangling and incinerating dozens of women. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a picture of a calculating, cold-blooded predator. Led by Assistant State Attorney Laura Pierce, the team presented Richard as the textbook definition of a psychopath, someone who masked his evil beneath a cultivated image of perfection. Richard Grayson is not just a man who killed, Pierce opened, her voice steady yet electric with urgency. He is a man who hunted. He is a man who thrived on power, a man who destroyed lives to feed his need to dominate, and today we will show you how he did it, and why he must be brought to justice. She laid out the prosecution's strategy, tying Grayson to at least 12 confirmed murders through DNA evidence, financial records tracking purchases of his sinister tools, digital correspondence that lured his victims, and most damning of all, Cynthia Harper's harrowing testimony. Piece by piece, Pierce promised to unwind the double life Grayson had so carefully constructed. But the defense, as brazen as it seemed, countered with a different portrait altogether. Grayson's attorney, Jacob Ellison, a high-profile and controversial figure, painted him as a victim of circumstance. Ellison leaned heavily on the lack of bodies, all other than fragments of ash and microscopic bone dust, suggesting that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and public hysteria. "We are not here to convict a man on whispers," Ellison told the court. "We are here for facts. And the fact is there is no definitive proof that Richard Grayson killed anyone." Grayson sat stoically, his face composed, devoid of emotion as these opening statements flew like daggers over his head. The jury, 8 women and 4 men, watched him warily, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. The testimony of terror. The prosecution's case hinged on one testimony, Cynthia Harper. On the 3rd day of the trial, Cynthia was called to the stand. The gallery fell silent as she entered, her hands trembling slightly, yet her gaze fiercely determined. With piercing clarity, she recounted the nightmare she endured on Halloween night, how she'd been lured to Grayson's suburban home with unsuspecting ease, how he had transformed from a charming gentleman to a merciless monster, how she had fought with every ounce of strength she had to escape that steel basement. Her voice cracked only once as she described the terror she felt while tied to the chair, staring into the eyes of a man who viewed her life as disposable. "He was calm," she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the rail of the witness stand. "Too calm. I kept thinking, this can't be real, this can't be happening." But it was. The way he looked at me, I was nothing to him. I was just his next piece of fun. When Pierce asked her to identify the man who had attacked her, Cynthia's shaking finger extended toward Richard Grayson. For the first time during the trial, Grayson's lip curled into what could only be described as a smirk, a fleeting but sinister reminder of his nature. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and even the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cynthia's testimony was gut-wrenching, but it was only the start. The prosecution unveiled the mountain of evidence meticulously gathered during the investigation. The digital footprint linking Grayson to fake profiles on dating apps used to lure women, receipts for sedatives and industrial cleaners, and the grim trophy cabinet found in his basement, filled with personal effects that matched items reported missing by victims' families. The ash and bone fragments discovered in the furnace sealed the argument. "This was not a man acting out of impulse or rage," Pierce told the jury. "This was a man who planned every detail, every step, who made sure his victims, not just their bodies but their lives, disappeared." A hollow defense. While the prosecution built an unshakable case, the defense struggled to counter with something substantial. Ellison doubled down on portraying Grayson as a victim of circumstantial evidence and societal bias against successful men. He called on a character witness from Grayson's workplace who described him as kind, hardworking, and incapable of harming anyone. But each piece of testimony from the defense was easily dismantled by the prosecution, which wielded evidence that shook the jury to its core. When Grayson was called to testify, Ellison's strategy unraveled. Grayson sat on the stand with an unnervingly calm demeanor, mechanically answering each question without a shred of remorse. At one point, when Pierce cross-examined him about the trophies found in his home, Grayson's mask slipped. "Women use men. They take. They manipulate," he said, his voice void of feeling as if reciting a shopping list. The room froze. "All I did was show them what the end of that road looks like." It was a rare admission, and one that immediately galvanized the jury. No longer was Grayson simply hiding behind denials. His true, twisted ideology was laid bare, and it was irredeemable. The verdict. After 6 long months of testimony, evidence, and heart-wrenching accounts from the victims' families, the jury reached a unanimous decision. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood, holding the lives of so many in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Grayson, guilty of all counts of murder in the 1st degree." A collective exhale swept the gallery. Tears of both relief and grief flowed from the families who had fought for this moment. For them, justice had prevailed, but the price had been unimaginably steep. Grayson showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He remained stoic as the judge sentenced him to death, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of his crimes. It was only when he was escorted out of the courtroom that his composure finally broke. Smiling at the cameras flashing around him, he muttered something chilling under his breath. "I'll always be remembered." The legacy of the trial. The trial of Richard Grayson left scars on Chicago that would take years to heal. For families of the victims, it was a bittersweet conclusion. The killer had been stopped, but their loved ones could never be brought back. For the legal system, it raised painful questions about the failures of law enforcement, about the biases that had allowed so many warnings to go unnoticed. Courtrooms are places for verdicts, but they often become theaters for humanity's greatest tragedies. And in the case of Richard Grayson, the trial was not just about one man's guilt. It was about the resilience of those left behind, the courage of the one who survived, and the sobering knowledge that even in the most vibrant cities, evil can hide behind the brightest smiles. The twisted psychology of a killer. Richard Grayson wasn't the type of person anyone would suspect as a killer. That's what made him so dangerous. On the surface, he was polite, charming, and successful, a man who could win strangers over with a smile and build trust with a handshake. But beneath that carefully curated exterior lay a psychological labyrinth of darkness and depravity. To understand Richard Grayson as a serial killer is to delve into the chilling depths of his psyche, a mind fueled by hatred, manipulation, and an insatiable need for control. A childhood of control and chaos. Like many serial killers, Richard's descent into darkness didn't begin with the murders themselves. It began much earlier, in his own childhood. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Richard grew up in a lower-middle-class home dominated by dysfunction. His mother, an emotionally unstable and verbally abusive woman, ruled the household with an iron fist. She belittled Richard constantly, attacking his sense of self-worth, and planting the seeds of deep-seated insecurity that would haunt him for life. His father, on the other hand, was a passive, withdrawn man, a shadow in the toxic environment, who did little to shield his son from the torrent of emotional abuse. From a young age, Richard was exposed to an imbalance of power in the most intimate setting. His family, his mother's dominance and cruelty taught him one simple lesson: control equaled power, but more importantly it instilled in him a simmering hatred, particularly toward women. To young Richard, women became symbols of authority and humiliation, reminders of his mother's cutting words and suffocating control. This early experience of powerlessness shaped his worldview, fostering a warped sense of entitlement that would later manifest in horrifying ways. At school, Richard attempted to mask his insecurities by striving for perfection. He excelled academically, always impeccably dressed, always composed. Yet, he struggled socially. His classmates often described him as too perfect or unnervingly polite, as though he were performing a role rather than being a genuine person. In truth, Richard was already crafting the facade that would later become his most dangerous weapon: the ability to appear completely ordinary while hiding unfathomable darkness within. The need for dominance. As Richard grew older, his feelings of inadequacy didn't diminish. They evolved. On the outside, he appeared to have it all: a successful career in real estate, a polished appearance, and financial stability. But none of it dulled the gnawing void inside him. His interactions with women, despite his charm and good looks, were fraught with resentment and bitterness. Women who rejected him, whether overtly or subtly, weren't just disappointments to Richard. They were personal insults, validating the toxic narrative his mother had instilled in him. He began to see confident, independent women as threats, symbols of the control he could never have in his childhood but now obsessively sought to reclaim. Richard's need for dominance extended beyond relationships. In his professional life, he demanded perfection, meticulously curating every interaction and appearance. But it was never enough. The control he craved couldn't be satisfied through achievements or societal approval. His mind began to turn toward darker methods, ways to assert ultimate power over those he felt had wronged him: women. For men like Richard, murder wasn't simply an act of violence. It was the ultimate expression of control. In taking someone's life, he wasn't just ending their existence. He was asserting complete authority over them, erasing their agency, their autonomy, their very humanity. Every act of manipulation, every calculated move, brought Richard closer to the intoxicating high he sought, the feeling of godlike power over another person, the double life. To maintain his killing spree without arousing suspicion, Richard developed a chillingly effective dual identity. On one side, he was Richard Grayson, the well-dressed professional and stand-up neighbor who waved at passers-by and volunteered at charity events. This version of Richard was a mask, a performance so convincing that even those closest to him had no reason to question his true nature. But the other side of Richard, the predator, was a man consumed by meticulous planning and cold calculation. Unlike impulsive killers who acted on chaotic whims, Richard operated with precision. He didn't just murder, he orchestrated his crimes like a symphony, each element carefully considered. From selecting his victims to eliminating evidence, everything Richard did was guided by an obsessive need to control every detail. His crimes were not crimes of passion but of meticulous execution, reflecting the chilling logic of a man who viewed life and death as a game to be won, the predator's mindset. Richard's victims all shared common traits. They were independent, confident women in their late 20s to 30s, the kind of women who embodied the autonomy Richard both envied and despised. To him, these women represented everything he could never control, a haunting reminder of his own shortcomings. But Richard didn't just kill his victims, he hunted them. He studied their routines, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. In many ways, his mind operated like that of a wolf stalking prey. He would isolate his targets, lure them in with charm, and strike when they were most defenseless. For victims like Cynthia Harper, Richard's ability to mask his true intentions until the very last moment made him all the more terrifying. He didn't just take lives, he dismantled them, piece by piece, leaving no room for resistance. What set Richard apart from other killers wasn't just his cunning or his careful planning, it was his complete lack of remorse. To Richard, his victims weren't people, they were objects, means to an end. In interviews conducted by psychologists after his arrest, Richard spoke about his crimes with a chilling detachment. "They were already broken," he once said. "I just finished the job." The trophy collector. Perhaps the most disturbing insight into Richard's psyche came in the form of his trophies. Like many serial killers, Richard kept items from his victims, not because he missed them, but because he needed to relive the feeling of dominance he experienced during their murders. The items weren't sentimental, they were symbols, tokens of his victories. A bracelet, a pair of earrings, a photograph, all ordinary objects to the outside world, but to Richard, proof of his superiority. Psychologists suggest that the act of keeping trophies served a deeper psychological need. By holding on to these items, Richard wasn't just reminiscing, he was reaffirming his power, reminding himself that he had silenced these women, erased their independence and reduced them to mere possessions. In his mind, the trophies were validation of his twisted quest for control. The narcissistic void. At the core of Richard's psychology lay a gaping void, an inability to find fulfillment no matter how far he pushed. Psychologists who later analyzed him described him as a textbook narcissist with sociopathic tendencies. He craved admiration, power, and control, but no amount of success or dominance could ever fill the emptiness inside him. Richard's need to kill stemmed from this insatiable hunger, a dark spiral fed by his inability to truly connect with others and his obsessive need to compensate for the powerlessness of his childhood. But while narcissism and sociopathy explain many of Richard's behaviors, they don't account for everything. What made him truly terrifying wasn't just his psychology but his methodical nature. Richard didn't kill out of compulsion or uncontrollable rage, he killed because he could. And in that horrifying realization lies the true horror of his crimes, an ordinary man who chose to do the unthinkable simply because he wanted to. A mind without redemption. As the world unraveled the twisted mind of Richard Grayson, one thing became clear. There was no redemption for someone like him. His actions were not the result of temporary insanity or fleeting impulses. They were part of a deliberate, calculated pattern, a lifelong thirst for control and dominance that left a trail of destruction in its wake. Even after his conviction, Richard's psychological profile remains a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for evil. He was not a monster lurking in the shadows but a man hiding in plain sight. And while psychologists may continue to study him in search of answers, the truth of Richard Grayson's mind may never be fully understood. The role of the community. The Richard Grayson case didn't just expose the twisted psyche of a serial killer, it illuminated the vital role that communities play in achieving justice, spreading awareness, and holding institutions accountable. While the crimes of one man devastated countless families, it was the collective strength of neighbors, families, activists, and concerned citizens that ultimately helped turn the tide in a case riddled with systemic failures. In a city as vast as Chicago, where people often live fast-paced, individualistic lives, community support can sometimes feel distant or irrelevant. But as the disappearances of independent and promising young women accelerated, everyday people began to notice something was seriously wrong. Mothers whispered to each other in parks about their growing unease. Friends who had been overlooked by law enforcement organized search parties. Strangers from entirely different neighborhoods joined online forums dedicated to solving the mystery. Slowly, the people of Chicago realized that waiting for the system to work was no longer an option. They had to act. The first signs of collective concern. As the string of missing women went largely ignored by the police for months, families of the victims began turning to their communities for help. Flyers became the silent screams of desperate families, appearing on every street corner, train station, cafe, and grocery store. Pictures of smiling young women stared back at passers-by, each accompanied by the same heart-wrenching question, "Have you seen her?" These flyers may have been small acts at first, but they served as seeds for an extraordinary movement. Social media, still in its infancy at the time, became an unexpected ally. Online forums dedicated to local mysteries started buzzing with activity, connecting people who were equally terrified and frustrated. The members of these forums, students, office workers, shopkeepers, and even stay-at-home parents, began compiling information and noticing the patterns that the police failed to see. They shared tips, theories, and potential sightings, creating a digital paper trail that investigators had largely ignored. Neighborhoods quickly banded together, forming unofficial search committees and community watches. Residents patrolled streets at odd hours, checked empty lots, searched isolated parks, and knocked on doors to spread the word. It wasn't just about looking for the missing, it was about creating a sense of safety for women across Chicago. Women who once walked to their cars alone after work now had volunteers offering to walk them home. Local businesses even took part, donating resources for missing person campaigns or posting hotline numbers for anyone who might witness something suspicious. Shining a light on systemic failure. The most vital role the community played wasn't just in searching, it was in calling out the failures that allowed Richard Grayson to thrive. Many families had grown frustrated with the police's lack of urgency, and they began speaking louder. At rallies, press conferences, and public hearings, they demanded answers. Parents of the missing women stood shoulder to shoulder, holding photos of their loved ones, their voices unshakable as they asked the same question, "Why aren't you doing more?" One of the most poignant moments came when Ruth Sims, Eleanor's mother, spoke in front of dozens of reporters. If Eleanor had been anyone else, if she'd come from a wealthier neighborhood, if she'd worked at some prestigious law firm, would you have ignored her calls for help too? Or is it easier for you to label these women as runaways, so you don't have to do your jobs? Her words echoed not just throughout the press but through entire neighborhoods, galvanizing people to put even more pressure on the authorities to take action. Community activism also made national headlines, ultimately drawing the attention of organizations with broader networks and resources. For missing and exploited women stepped in, raising money for reward funds and ensuring that the pressure on law enforcement didn't wane. The message was clear. The women of Chicago were not disposable, and their stories would not be forgotten. The ripple effect of awareness. As the community mobilized, a ripple effect began to spread across Chicago and beyond. The case, once buried in local news, became the focus of national media attention, as persistent voices pushed the narrative from a local tragedy to a nationwide discussion. The question of how community action could expose what law enforcement ignored became central to debates on policing and public safety. Schools, colleges, and businesses took notice, incorporating seminars on self-defense and public safety into their programs. Bars and nightclubs began implementing safe word policies that allowed patrons to discreetly alert staff if they felt threatened. The streets of Chicago, which had once been indifferent and cold, felt suddenly alive with urgency, awareness, and a sense of collective responsibility. At the same time, Chicago's women began to empower one another. Friend groups became tighter, more vigilant, texting to check in after nights out or walking each other to car doors. Local instructors began offering self-defense workshops, teaching women how to recognize danger and defend themselves physically. Stores saw a marked increase in the sale of pepper spray and personal safety alarms, with some communities even holding events to distribute safety kits to young women. More importantly, dialogue began to shift within neighborhoods about how society viewed female independence. Instead of shaming women for living alone, enjoying nightlife, or using dating apps, people began openly questioning why their city, why their police department had failed to keep them safe. Chicago wasn't just grieving, it was evolving. How communities pushed the case over the line. When Cynthia Harper made her daring escape and identified Richard Grayson as her captor, it was the community that ensured her story was heard. Without the groundwork laid by furious neighbors, persistent grassroots advocacy, and media attention, there was a good chance her account would have faced the same dismissive treatment as the missing women's families had endured for years. But now, the tide had turned. The cautious, dismissive voices of law enforcement were drowned out by the rallying cry of an angered city demanding justice. The forums that had shared missing person flyers and tips now pivoted to providing updates on the investigation. Families who had once felt ignored were invited to participate in broad discussions about how they could piece together the missing threads of evidence in their loved ones' cases. Perhaps most powerfully, Chicago's community proved the undeniable truth: no one person alone could defeat a monster like Richard Grayson, but a united city could. The lasting impact. The role of the community in this case became a template for how cities could respond to not only serial crimes but systemic neglect. The case rippled through American culture, forcing conversations that stretched far beyond Chicago's borders. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reassessing their policies on missing person cases, particularly those involving women and young adults. Community-led initiatives, once seen as limited or performative, were given newfound respect as essential tools in the fight for justice. However, the scars of those months lingered long after Richard Grayson's conviction. The families he devastated reminded Chicago, and the world, that the community's fight wasn't born out of choice, it was born out of necessity. They were ordinary people forced into extraordinary action because the system designed to protect them had failed, and their efforts remain a testament to what people can achieve when they refuse to let their voices be silenced. Richard Grayson's crimes may have shaken Chicago to its core, but they also revealed its strength. The community transformed from a loose network of strangers into a united force, one that demanded accountability, justice, and above all, safety for its most vulnerable members. It's a legacy that lives on in every flyer pinned on a light pole, every neighborhood watch meeting, and every determined voice that stands up to ask, what can we do to help? The aftermath and lasting legacy. The story of Richard Grayson didn't end with his trial, conviction, or even his execution. The ripple effects of his crimes, the trauma he caused, and the failures that allowed him to flourish left permanent scars on the city of Chicago and the people who lived through the nightmare. His reign of terror wasn't just a series of horrific murders. It was a collective tragedy that forced an entire community, and even the nation, to confront uncomfortable truths about injustice, negligence, and human resilience. For the families, grief without end. For the families of Grayson's victims, justice may have been served, but closure was something far more elusive. The mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends left behind faced an emotional battle that would stretch on for years. Many of the victims' remains were incinerated in Grayson's industrial furnace, leaving nothing tangible for their loved ones to bury or say goodbye to. For these families, the absence of a physical grave robbed them of a crucial element of healing. Eleanor Sims's mother, Ruth, spoke often to the press about the unrelenting ache of loss. "I couldn't bury my daughter," she once said, holding a framed photograph of Eleanor during a tearful interview. "I couldn't dress her in her favorite clothes or choose flowers for her grave. My baby disappeared into thin air, and even now, with him locked away, it still feels like she's out there somewhere, waiting for me to bring her home." For others, the pain was compounded by guilt. Survivors like the parents of Jessica Harper admitted to questioning everything they'd done in the weeks prior to her disappearance. Could I have called her more? Could I have warned her not to go jogging so early, not to trust strangers? It's impossible not to replay it all in your head, Jessica's father confessed in a local Chicago magazine piece. Therapy became a lifeline for some, while others threw themselves into advocacy work, using their voices to push for reforms in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. Yet, for all their resilience, the scars left by Grayson's acts of cruelty would never fully fade. For the city of Chicago, a stain on its trust. Richard Grayson's crimes left more than emotional devastation in their wake. They left the entire city of Chicago grappling with a sense of betrayal. For years, Grayson had operated right under everyone's noses, hiding behind the camouflage of charm and success. He wasn't skulking in alleyways or hiding in the shadows. He was a neighbor, a smiling face at the community fundraiser, the kind of man people called trustworthy. His ability to blend seamlessly into society shook public trust in a profound way. The failures of the Chicago Police Department only deepened the collective trauma. Every detail of how the system had underestimated Richard, of families being dismissed, red flags being ignored, and investigations delayed, became fuel for public anger. When Cynthia Harper's story first broke, protesters gathered outside police headquarters holding signs that read, "Never again, and listen to us." Police Chief Patrick Langley publicly apologized, admitting that institutional bias and resource misallocation had contributed to the delays in addressing the missing women's cases. But for many Chicagoans, the apology felt hollow. The system's indifference had cost lives, and no amount of regret could erase that reality. In the wake of the case, public pressure forced the department to re-evaluate its protocols for missing persons and serial crime investigations. Specialized training programs were introduced, and an independent review board was established to create accountability in handling potential serial cases. A new national dialogue. The Richard Grayson case reverberated far beyond Chicago, sparking a national dialogue about how law enforcement, communities, and society at large handle violence against women. The case raised difficult questions. Why were the women dismissed as runaways or victims of their own choices? How did someone as methodical as Richard evade detection for so long? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many other predators operated with the same invisibility? Advocacy groups used the case to shine a spotlight on broader issues, from systemic sexism to flaws in criminal profiling. Time magazine ran a cover story titled, "Invisible Threats, When Charm Hides Danger," examining how societal biases against women often contributed to their victimization. Groups like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Women reported a surge in donations and public engagement following the revelation of Richard's crimes. The case became a frequent point of discussion in legal and criminal psychology conferences, with experts dissecting Grayson's psychology and the investigation's failures in brutal detail. The cultural impact didn't stop there. Television shows and documentaries dramatized his story, some sensationalizing it, others digging deep into the systemic failures surrounding the case. Titles like The Gentleman Killer and The Chicago Nightmare dominated streaming platforms, ensuring that people far removed from the events would still learn the cautionary tale. For women, a collective wake-up call. One of the most profound aftershocks of the case was the chilling realization among women across Chicago and the nation that no one was truly immune from such dangers. Grayson's victims weren't reckless or irresponsible. They were everyday women who trusted the wrong person, who didn't fit the stereotypical image of someone in danger. That universality created a wave of fear but also galvanized collective action. Self-defense classes saw a massive uptick in attendance. Community organizations began distributing resources to empower women, from informational guides on spotting manipulative behavior to physical tools like pepper spray and personal alarms. Bars, gyms, and dating apps in Chicago introduced new safety measures, such as anonymous reporting systems and staff training to recognize signs of predatory behavior. Beyond the practical changes, there was a shift in the cultural conversation. Instead of blaming women for being too trusting or too careless, people started questioning the systems and cultural norms that allowed predators to thrive. Chicago's women were no longer content being told to watch out. They demanded systemic accountability and change. A dark legacy. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Richard Grayson's crimes is the inescapable fact that, even in death, he left a mark on the world. For those who lived through his reign of terror, his story became a symbol of humanity's darkest capacity, a reminder that true monsters are often the ones who look, act, and sound like us. Psychologists studying the case framed Grayson as a perfect storm of narcissism, sociopathy, and opportunity. His ability to manipulate and control, combined with systemic indifference, allowed him to build a terrifying legacy of fear. Even now, years after his execution, his name remains infamous, a warning of what can happen when evil goes unchecked. For others, the case is a story of resilience and defiance. Cynthia Harper's daring escape, the relentless advocacy of the victims' families, and the community's refusal to stay silent, all serve as reminders of the human ability to fight back against darkness. Chicago may never fully recover from the scars left by Richard Grayson, but it is a city that learned to confront its failures, and emerge stronger. The lesson that lingers in the end: the Richard Grayson case is more than just a tale of horror. It's a profound wake-up call. It forces society to confront its vulnerability, its biases, and its responsibilities. It serves as a reminder that monsters like Richard Grayson don't thrive in a vacuum. They flourish in systems that dismiss red flags, communities that hesitate to intervene, and cultures that fail to value vigilance over comfort. While the community of Chicago has moved forward, the lessons of the case remain deeply embedded in its collective consciousness. Flyers for missing persons are no longer ignored. Conversations about safety and accountability are no longer dismissed. And for every candlelit vigil, self-defense seminar, or neighborhood watch meeting, the names of Eleanor Sims, Jessica Harper, and countless others serve as an enduring call to action. Richard Grayson may be gone, but his story ensures one to